Bringing Invincible from comic book pages to the small screen was never going to be easy. Robert Kirkman's superhero epic is packed with jaw-dropping action, deep character arcs, and enough blood and guts to make a butcher queasy. And to be fair, Amazon Prime's animated adaptation has done a stellar job capturing a lot of that magic. Throughout the past 3 seasons, it has given us Omni-Man's terrifying dominance, Mark's gut-wrenching struggles, and plenty of meme-worthy moments that have taken over the internet. But who are we really kidding? Some things just don't hit the same. Whether it's character arcs that got trimmed down, brutal fights that lost their edge, or world building that felt a little undercooked, there are definitely parts of the Invincible comics that outshine the show. And with Season 3 recently bowing out with a banger finale, now is probably the perfect time to take a step back and ask, what did the comics do better? What moments felt truly invincible in print but got defanged in animation? From diluted villain threats to missing character depth, we are diving into certain moments from Invincible Season 3 where the show pulled its punches. So, without wasting another moment, let's get right to it. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The battle between Conquest and Invincible ran for 4 whole issues in the comics. Now, I know that the Prime Video series easily covered almost 10 to 15 issues with 2 major events in an entire season, but still, some things deserve to be more fleshed out. Like, Conquest and Mark started fighting in issue 61, and by the time it ended with the Viltrumite brute getting smashed to a mushy pulp, we were well into issue 64. But that's not the point here. Few things were really sped up in the show, because issue 62 mostly documents Conquest simply beating the shit out of Mark from point to another, and they were going just so fast that even Cecile could not keep a track of them. As the world was barely reeling from the Invincible War, most superheroes were either fatally injured, while others were still trying to process the whole thing. So, even if Cecile wanted to send superheroes to help Invincible, he needed time to call backup. While a lot of things are exactly similar, the battle in the comics was much more grotesque simply because of how violently it was stretched out. Given Mark had just been through the Invincible War and was worrying about a dying Eve, this fight was really a lot on his plate. In the comics, after seeing that Mark did not do his assigned duty, Conquest makes it clear that he has never failed to conquer a planet, and that Mark will die if he continues to oppose the plan. This is when Mark admits that he has been waiting for someone to fight him, just so he can release his anger. Next we know the two charge at each other, and their collision creates a massive shockwave, sending debris flying and knocking workers off balance. Conquest easily overpowers Mark, smashing him through a building. Meanwhile, seeing Mark take a hit for the worse, a worried Oliver rushes to help and tries to catch up to Mark and Conquest, but the two are moving so fast that he simply can't keep up. During this moment, Mark attempts to talk to Conquest, but the Viltrumite refuses to stop, as he is very clearly enjoying the fight. In an attempt to help, Oliver ambushes Conquest, who demands to know who he is, but Mark quickly rushes to save Oliver, throwing him aside to get him out of danger. Conquest then slams Mark down, pressing his elbow against his neck. An undeterred Mark goes on to headbutt Conquest, which only seems to amuse him. The brute then catches Mark's next punch and warns him that if this was all the strength he had, he will definitely die. On the other hand, Eve finally regains consciousness and spots Mark fighting on TV. After accidentally giving away the truth that her boyfriend is indeed invincible, she asks a doctor to contact Cecil and have him transport her to the battle. Meanwhile, Conquest is tossing Mark around with ease. This is when Oliver jumps in and catches Conquest off guard before helping Mark to his feet. But the Viltrumite proceeds to swap Mark away to focus on Oliver, landing a brutal punch that knocks out many of Oliver's teeth and breaks his arm. Just when Conquest attempts to tear the child in half, Mark intervenes to throw him aside. As he resumes fighting Conquest, Cecile orders a med team to pick up Oliver. Anyways, as Conquest hurls Mark into a destroyer ship hovering over an island, he fights back by landing a punch, but before he can react, Eve arrives to help. Mark was horrified to see Eve coming for his rescue, but before he could say much, Conquest grabbed him and snapped his leg, sending pain ripping through Mark as he screamed. As a result, Eve tried to contain Conquest in an energy bubble, but he shattered it with ease. Before she can even react, he brutally beats her and then, in one swift, merciless move, impales his fist through her body. Mark barely catches Eve as she collapses, and his hands begin to shake as he holds her close. An amused Conquest licks the blood from his finger and thanks Mark for the legendary fight. But after having lost the love of his life, Mark's eyes were burning with fury, and he did not care how strong or fast Conquest was. He grits his teeth and vows as challenges the Viltrumite, but an unfazed Conquest throws his head back and laughs in Mark's face. The two then charge at each other with their fists colliding with devastating force. While the impact shatters Mark's forearm and destroys Conquest's cybernetic arm, the older Viltrumite barely flinches, simply grinning at the thrill of battle. As the brutal fight rages on, Eve, who had been on the brink of death, suddenly wakes up and her body begins to rebuild itself, fully regenerating before Mark's eyes. He continues to pound Conquest into the ground, but when he glances toward Eve, a sense of relief washes over him. Sadly, that split-second distraction costs him as Conquest lands a vicious punch, sending Mark reeling. But before Conquest can press the advantage, Eve fires a powerful energy blast, scorching his skin and leaving him charred and burned. Unfortunately, this effort drains her completely, and she collapses, now completely vulnerable. Conquest was still barely affected by the blast, and so he turned his attention to her, ready to finish the job. But before he could even touch Eve, Mark goes blind with pure rage as he launches himself at Conquest with fists hammering down in a frenzy. Now, the shocker comes, as Conquest catches Mark's punch mid-swing and, with a sickening crunch, crushes his hand. As Mark lets out a scream of agony, a sadistic Conquest simply chuckles after being visibly entertained by his suffering. Still, Invincible refuses to back down. With every ounce of strength he has left, Mark repeatedly slams his forehead into Conquest's face, again and again, until the bloodthirsty brute is barely recognizable. Now, there are a few changes the show made which I think was fantastic, like allowing Eve to actually put up a fight against before getting gutted down or the whole monologue that Conquest delivers to Mark about how his strength made him so fearful that he never had a friend and was always lonely. As crazy as it sounds, it sort of humanized even a maniac like Conquest and actually gave us insights on his character being more than someone who was in it for a good fight. But then their fight was really not as juicy and downright insane as you can see through the comic panels across those 4 issues. Like the way Mark ate dust for the first few pages, we really thought there was no hope left for the planet. The comic just did it better. If the show had fleshed out the violence, we would have definitely enjoyed it much more. Debbie's mental breakdown after Mark woke up from his coma. So, after the battle with Conquest, Mark was out pretty good. There was not a single part of his body that was not injured in that fight. Taking down someone as mighty as Conquest really tuckered Mark out, and so he was in a coma for almost 3 days. In the show, when Mark woke up from his comatose state, Debbie walked in on him and Eve sharing a moment, and, like any concerned mother, she was an absolute mess. She blamed herself for listening to Nolan and allowing Mark to put himself in such risks every day. But after Mark reassured her, she hugged him and all was well in the world, at least in that moment. Now, in the comics, Debbie was a train wreck. She was so worried about Mark that she began throwing fits and even snapped on Eve. In the comics, Debbie and Paul walked in on Eve and Mark getting all sloppy with one another. When her entrance took the couple by surprise, Debbie assured Eve that it was okay and then walked towards Mark. Once she took a closer look at Mark, Debbie had an insane mental breakdown. She began herself for Mark's condition. According to her, she brought Mark into this life and raised him into the superhero lifestyle. She knew the kind of powers Nolan had, and so in a way, they encouraged him to put his life at risk. So every time Mark goes out there to put himself in a fatal situation, Debbie naturally thinks that it was all happening because of the decisions she took. In fact, in the comics, she regrets not taking Mark away from this lifestyle when she still had the chance. Debbie says that they could have done something else when Mark's powers surfaced. Anything would have been better than seeing him burn out like that. When Mark tries to tell her that what he was doing with his powers was better because people needed him, Debbie went mad with anger. According to her, people needed heroes, and Earth had plenty of them, so they did not need him. This is when Eve butted into the conversation and weighed in on how the Viltrumite actually came for Mark, meaning he could not have quit, even if he wanted to. In response, Debbie just screamed at Eve and then collected herself to apologize, as she did not know what she was rambling in rage. We see Debbie walking out of the room, and when Eve tries to stop her, Mark asks her to let his mum go as she was upset and needed some time. This whole drama was barely scratched in the show, and I really wonder why, because Debbie is an important person in Mark's life. If they actually fleshed out this scene a bit, it would honestly make Mark swearing to Oliver about not hesitating to kill anyone who tried to harm his loved ones all the more impactful. The Invincible War was way too rushed in the show. As compared to the Prime Video series, the comic version of the Invincible War featured a staggering amount of Image Comics guest stars, making it one of the most exciting and frenetic comic book crossovers of its kind, while at the same time ensuring that it would also rank among the most difficult to adapt. I mean, Invincible issue number 60 literally fits an entire crossover event into one single issue. This earth-shattering event is basically predicated on Invincible's most infamous enemy, Angstrom Levy, traveling the multiverse and gathering evil versions of Mark Grayson in order to get revenge on Invincible for nearly killing him in their previous encounter. When the evil Marks invade the main Invincible universe, the heroes of Image Comics rally together to face the threat, leading to a fight that is as chaotic and brutal as it is filled with cameo appearances by heroes from throughout Image's decades-long history. Among the most notable Image superheroes and militaries who appear in Invincible issue 60 to take down all of Invincible's evil variants from across the multiverse are Spawn, Savage Dragon, Youngblood, Madman, Fire Breather, Witchblade, The Darkness, and Jack Staff, with many more joining the fight before the issue ends. When I first read the comics, The Invincible War was a remarkable story in several ways. Approximately 5 years into Invincible's run, Robert Kirkman and his collaborators delivered the ongoing series' most brutal, intense action yet, by surpassing an already high standard for superhero violence that it had established up to that point. Of course, this can be overshadowed by the truly exciting thing about the story, which is the full integration of Image Comics' catalogue of characters into the Invincible universe. In addition to connecting the publisher's past and present, it was also a full-blown culmination of Robert Kirkman's career up to that point. The early Image Comics era was highly formative for Kirkman, who has cited the influence of the company's extreme 90s aesthetic and innovative storytelling on his own work for the company a decade plus later. In particular, the author has spoken about Savage Dragon as a major inspiration, making his opportunity to use the character in the Invincible War hold a great deal of meaning beyond just what happened on the page. Also, you should know that Invincible issue 60's single-panel cameo for Spawn was unarguably Image's most famous creation, at least prior to Kirkman's era. Not just that, with all the amazing superhero teams like Cyberforce, Youngblood, Dynamo 5, and Capes Incorporated making amazing cameos, you could really see in every panel of the comic in the various ways they strategized and delegated themselves through the 3 days of the Invincible War and really came through, even if it came at the cost of some of their lives. Not fleshing out their struggles or even narrowing in on how the Teen Team and the Guardians dealt with the war really undermines their efforts. We had waited to see the Invincible War come to life for so long, and when it did in episode 7 of season 3, it barely lasted for 30 minutes. It was so rushed that at one point everything we saw on the screen began to jumble up and come off as straight up confusing. They really had the potential to make it one of the best episodes or events in the show, but unfortunately they fumbled hard to fit everything within a certain time frame. While I understand that the creators of the show wanted us to feel one with the heroes, who were also having a difficult time keeping up with everything that was happening around them, without having the space to recover, still, one episode was not enough to do justice to such an important crossover event in the Invincible lore. It just does not give you enough to cherish Rex's heroic sacrifice, revel in the gruesomely choreographed battles, or come at par with Mark's game-changing realization of finally narrowing down on Angstrom Levy being the mastermind behind the raging ruckus. Many superhero cameos in the Invincible War were cut out of the show. Like I said before, The Invincible is a crazy crossover event with many superhero cameos, but unfortunately, the reason behind it being one of the most difficult events to adapt is because of these cameos. While the Prime Video series definitely brought the lore to life by doing the best they could, there were just too many obstacles to cross in order to cope with the ambitious scope of the Invincible War. While characters like Wolfman, Brit, Best Tiger, Tech Jacket, Throwbolt, Big Mildew, Bug-Eye, Burly, The Hunk, Business Baby, Shrapnel, Kid Thor, etc. made the best use of their cameos and gave us a power-packed, action-filled battle with evil Invincible variants. Still, there were a lot of amazing and really exciting characters in the comics that the makers of the animated show had to leave out. I don't really think the makers of the show can be blamed in this case, because most of these characters who could not make it to the screen are actually held up in a web of rights issues that make it practically impossible that they will ever be seen in the show. While we can still hope for the best, it is more than likely that these Invincible characters cannot be used by the show. For instance, Spawn is one of the most iconic comic characters created outside of DC and Marvel, and this Hellspawn character serves a skewed image of justice as he establishes himself as one cool and dark anti-hero throughout his run in the comics. Spawn has featured in a range of other collabs, but was not shown in Invincible, as he only appears for a short cameo alongside other heroes in the Invincible War, and while Todd McFarlane is generous with the IP that he owns with the character featuring in Mortal Kombat 11 and Call of Duty Warzone, a short cameo in an animated show might not have been enough to suffice him. There is also Duncan Belloc Rosenblatt, aka Fire Breather, who is born of demonic fate, where he discovers the fact that he is a hybrid of dragon and human. This guy's origin as a dragon-human hybrid has quite the range of burning powers that he seeks to use for good, even if a whole assortment of monsters seek him out to destroy him and halt his impending fate as their king. While Fire Breather does have a pretty cool backstory and his powers would fit right in within Invincible, he probably did not appear in the show fighting the evil Mark variants due to the fact that he was not created by Invincible's creator, Robert Kirkman, and has his own rights issues to deal with, especially when his comic cameo was so brief and restricted to just one proper panel of the comic. There is another famous superhero named Savage Dragon, who, just like Spawn, is an Image Comics character that is solely owned by its creator in terms of writing and artistry. Savage Dragon is a pretty dope hero and has been featured in independent comics for decades now as a strong, green-skinned, finned head hero who loves to punch his way through the drama and action that plagues his city. Savage Dragon isn't just relegated to a cameo in the Invincible War, and he does actually have a history alongside the titular character as a fellow hero, which makes his established role in the universe even more important. But since it's not a Robert Kirkman character, he does not show up anywhere in the Invincible War. Lastly, among other really cool cameos, we have Witchblade. So Sarah Pizzini was an NYPD detective who came into possession of the Witchblade, a gauntlet of unimaginable power that could bring about immense destruction. The history of the gauntlet ranges centuries, from Cleopatra and Joan of Arc, and now it falls to Sarah to wield this great power for the good of humanity. Witchblade is easily one of Image Comics' greatest characters, but the fact that there are so many rights issues involving creators, editors, and publishers, it's unlikely that she is ever going to ever featured in the Invincible comics, even if she has a decent history of spin-offs and team-ups with her own anime series, Lara Croft, and even Marvel and DC. She actually goes full-blown berserker on the evil Mark variants in the comics, and is even rendered unconscious until she comes back up for more. But sadly, to witness Witchblade's badass moves in the Invincible War, you have to flip through the pages of the comics. Amber has an abusive boyfriend in the comics, so Invincible Season 3, Episode 6 briefly sees the return of Amber, with one change to her comic book storyline potentially proving a controversial plot point will not happen in the show. Amber was a much more important part of Invincible's cast of characters in the first 2 seasons of the show than she was in Season 3. This certainly makes sense, given the breakup between her and Mark last season, and the renewed focus on Mark and Eve's relationship in Invincible Season 3. Nonetheless, Amber briefly appeared in Invincible Season 3 as she and her new boyfriend Kyle joined Eve, Mark, William, and Rick for a game of bowling. While things were awkward at first, Kyle and Mark immediately hit it off by speaking about Seance Dog, an in-universe comic book, diffusing any potential tension and rendering the triple date a success. Although it is unclear if Amber or Kyle will return back in Invincible's future, there is a huge story arc related to her character which seems to have been altered in the show. In the comics, Amber's next boyfriend, after her breakup with Mark, is someone named Gary. Gary seems okay at first, as he is shown to be protective and loving toward Amber. But then, one day, when Mark was with Eve, Amber called Mark and asked him to come over, only for him to see Amber with a bruised face. While she kept defending Gary and told Mark how he probably did not mean it, Mark was furious. In fact, Mark donned his suit and went as far to threaten Gary. He picked up the dude by his collar and warned him that if he ever laid a finger on Amber, Mark would kill him. But then, in one of Amber's last Invincible comic book appearances, she tells Mark that Gary had changed and that she was giving him another chance as he called and apologized. After Invincible Season 3, Episode 6, it seems like this storyline is being dropped for Prime Video's show, especially because they just cropped out the part where Mark goes back to Eve and tells him what went down with Amber and Gary, which ends with Eve supporting him. Instead, we saw Amber and Eve share a cup of coffee and hang out in the show. I think the introduction of Kyle, as opposed to Gary, is enough to imply that the makers of the show are essentially removing the entire controversial storyline of abuse from Amber's future. While future seasons could adapt this, and Kyle could simply take Gary's place in the storyline, it is admittedly unlikely after what Invincible Season 3, Episode 6 showed of Amber's new life. Powerplex has a more refined arc in the comics. In the Prime Video series, Powerplex was really this revenge-soaked, halfway insane guy who was pretty much blinded by his hatred for Invincible. But there is one thing the comics portrayed differently in his case. In The Invincible, Scott Duvall did not just seek revenge from Mark by holding him responsible for the death of his sister, but also wanted to show the world that Invincible was a fraud. In a way, all he could talk about was how he wanted to protect them, and at one point he even said it out loud that he was protecting the world from the destruction that Invincible was bringing about. Not just that, in the show, we see Powerplex as the guy who basically wants to track down Invincible, make him accept his crimes, and seize his justice by killing him. Unlike in the comics, the show does a pretty good job at even giving us a glimpse of how Jessica and her daughter die as the effect of the clash between Omni-Man and Invincible. It also shows us how Scott tries to track down the authorities and demands justice from them, only for them to ignore him when Invincible's name comes up. Even the whole Memorial Day arc with Scott trying to gain Mark's attention was not shown in the comics, but by exploring that, the Prime Video series definitely fleshed out the blinded vengeance in his character. I think there is only one thing that the show missed out on that comics covered. Basically, in the comics, after fighting Shapesmith, Powerplex also battles the entire team with Rex, Monster Girl, and Robot trying their best to stop him. But given that he absorbs energy and converts it into power, they fail at capturing him, and he gets away until the whole arc where he comes with the plan of fake kidnapping his wife and son, only to lure Invincible in to fight him. What I am trying to say is, Powerplex is shown to be much more powerful and impactful in the comics, where he is described as a man who wants to become a hero by ridding Invincible from the world, as opposed to the show, where all he seemed to care about was seeking revenge against Mark, even though he could barely even handle Atom Eve in a fight. The Wolfman crossover. Okay, so remember, when in Episode 3, Mark notices an orb spying on his family outside his house and goes directly to the Pentagon to hold Cecile responsible for it. Well, after their bloody and heated discussion, there was a pretty cool storyline that introduced the Wolfman, something that the show decided to cut out. In the comics, Cecile convinced Mark to go on one last mission for him, and after a lot of to and fro, Mark reluctantly agrees to it. In issue 57 of the Invincible comics, we meet Wolfman for the first time while he was being trained by Elder Brood. After Elder Brood informs Gary about a threat, he suits up in his werewolf form and leaves to deal with it. Meanwhile, after Cecile gets a call that a giant has escaped and Wolfman was also in the vicinity, he finally convinces Invincible to do the mission for him, as according to him, Wolfman was a cold-blooded killer who needed to be behind bars. So, when Mark reaches the fight scene, he notices Gary's futile attempts at subduing the giant, as it was so big he simply could not content it. When When the giant repeatedly asks to be left alone, Mark comes in, striking it on the head and grabs its neck in order to push it down. Mark then asks the giant to give up because the GDA would happily take it into custody and help it out if allowed. After that was solved, Wolfman, aka Gary, thanked Mark for having his back, who in turn thanked Gary for helping him against Dr. Seismic. But when Mark revealed that he must turn Gary in, the werewolf tried to escape, but Mark stopped him. Initially, Mark refused to listen to Gary, but eventually decided to hear him out. Gary then reveals that he never laid a hand on his wife. In fact, it was all a misunderstanding as his daughter found him next to the dead body of his wife, which caused her to believe he killed her. Gary then reverted to his human form and told Mark that it was Zechariah who murdered her, as Gary refused to work for him anymore. He then began to cry profusely, and even though Mark comforts him, he mentions that he must take Gary in, but the Wolfman refuses to go to jail, not without killing Zechariah and reconciling with his daughter. But when Mark mentioned that Cecile might end up recruiting him, Gary agreed to tag along. Following this, Mark and Gary arrived to a surprised Cecile and Agent Hunter in the White Room. When Mark tells Cecile that Gary wants to talk, Cecile immediately shuts that down, saying Gary has to be arrested. But Mark wasn't having it. Sensing where it was going, Cecile dismissed Agent Hunter, clearing the room for what's about to be a heated argument. Mark then pushed back, reminding Cecile that Darkwing 2 was already working with the Guardians of the Globe even after being a psychopathic killer. But Cecile doesn't budge from his point, as people knew that Gary killed his wife, making it clear that there was no coming back from that. Mark still stood his ground and refused to let Cecile take him in. But Cecile was prepared and so unleashed the Reaniman on Mark and Gary, ready to force the issue at hand. The whole thing then continues over to a separate comic issue known as The Astounding Wolfman. I honestly think this would be a pretty cool thing to watch if the show had covered it, but I guess there were time constraints, and maybe they did not want to deviate their focus from everything leading up to the Invincible War. Plus, it is also possible that the makers of the show simply could not portray the main Wolfman that we would know from the comic, along with his own comic spin-off due to rights issues with Image Comics and co-creators. So, there is definitely that. Anyways, that was it for this one. Do you guys think I missed out on any scene that was overtly diluted in the show as compared to the comics? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comment box.